Michele Bennett is our first willing, anxious, excited graduate student who's taken on quite an extraordinary topic, one that is often not widely looked at. And I tried to touch on the things that I thought were special about this, to combine ingredients that aren't often brought to the ecclesiastic table. And so look forward to your presentation. Just a reminder to all the graduate students, we're looking at 20, 25 minutes. You hold the floor. And then we leave a good half hour plus or minus for guests. And I want to invite anyone else to ask questions as well that's here joining with us. But Michele, we look forward to it.
Excellent. I've got my own.
Oh, yeah. I'm just the old-fashioned guy. Yeah.
Thank you.
It'd be good to be Phil Donovan and pass the mic to the guests.
Lovely.
So we enjoyed a lot.
All right. So I'm Michele Bennett. I'd like to welcome you all here to the first of exciting couple days of thesis presentations. Before I get started, I did want to thank my committee, thank my classmates, and most importantly, to thank my husband. Your support for this entire process has been really, really meaningful to me. So today, I want to talk to you about some of the challenges that are recently faced by the Episcopal Church, and really how architecture and urban design can help to play a role in improving some of those conditions. Now, ever since I was a young girl, I was fascinated by spiritual places. Now, part of that was because it really was this place where two very different worlds collided. But other part of it was that these spiritual places had an ability to evoke a very emotional response in me. Now, as I grew older, I really began to notice a changing spiritual environment. People didn't seem to be going to church as regularly or as often, and church didn't seem to play such an integral role in everyday lives. So coming into this thesis, my main question was, can architecture play a role in rebuilding a church community? So in order to assess this question, I thought it was important to focus on a particular denomination. The Episcopal Church really intrigued me, not only because it has a very strong sense of place rooted in the United States, but it also has a rich history of tradition, a very kind of a progressively evolving belief system, and it's also been strongly hit by declining numbers in recent years. Over the past decade, church membership has decreased by nearly 20%. 20% in 10 years, that's huge. But why? Now, there are several reasons as to why. Some of those are spiritually based reasons. There are reasons as far as whether they're not agreeing with the beliefs being put out there. They don't think that they line up with the Bible as well. Whatever they are, I'm not going to address those particular reasons in this thesis. However, there are other reasons that people are leaving the church. And one of those, which I kind of termed the busy lives theory, is that people are really, their lives are becoming more complex. They feel that church has just sort of sifted down through their list of priorities, and they don't have time to go out of their way to go to church. Now, a third reason is kind of more based upon the really historically white demographics of the Episcopal Church. And the reasons that the failure to reach beyond these ethnic barriers in a very increasingly diverse society is really hindering this membership. And as well, very low fertility rates in these predominant ethnic groups are really contributing to a decline in membership. So this thesis attempts to address these last two reasons. Now how can we architecturalize these things? First, and very importantly, instead of trying to bring people to the church, bring the church to the people. Okay? This is locating the church where people are already spending their time. Co-locate programmatic needs of the community. Schools, community centers, career centers, libraries, these sorts of things. Secondly, reach out to these underrepresented demographic groups. Locate the church in communities where Hispanic and African American are already well established in the area. So because this thesis involves taking the church to the people, choosing a location became critical. So in order to select a location, I first explored which regional provinces of the Episcopal Church were actually experiencing growth. There weren't many, let me tell you, but looking at the few that were experiencing growth in order to justify the creation of a new parish, I then looked at the cities in which these parishes, which fell within these parishes, and then layered in several demographics, such as locations of African American and Hispanic populations, population density, and existing Episcopal churches. Then layering those together as well as understanding the need for an already populated site. One particular location rose to the surface. So located within the Capitol Crossing Shopping Center, which is in an outlying neighborhood of Raleigh, North Carolina, very suburban, the existing site housed multiple big box stores along the perimeter and a vast sea of underutilized parking lots. Now, to the south end of the site is a retention pond, which connects to a series of hydrology flows through some of the adjacent neighborhoods. It became very apparent very quickly that the site required more urban interventions than I had originally anticipated. So I needed some priorities as far as the urban design of the site. The first was really a connection to the surrounding neighborhoods via these hydrology flows. The second was the creation of a civic plaza. Now this really harkened back to the historic plazas of the Hispanic culture. The third was really populating the site with mixed-use buildings, as well as dividing these large, vast seas of parking lots into more walkable blocks. And this is not finally, but really understanding that Raleigh is automobile-centric, and you're not going to be able to get away from it entirely. So maintaining ample parking for both the existing and the proposed businesses and residences. Creating a duality of location for the church itself, and that's having one side being a more public, civic side, and the other a more private, inwardly focused, pastoral side. And then finally, creating a hierarchy of the church complex within the surrounding site. So 3 neighborhood blocks were developed, each having ground level retail, and above were located apartments and townhomes, and each interior had an elevated green space above surface level parking. So if you're looking and seeing, making sure that we have adequate parking is underneath. In addition, the church complex itself contains several both retail and community servicing programs, as well as a school and a community center, and of course the church itself. The church connects with a series of ponds which flow down into a larger retention pond, which then connects into a series of hydrology flows. So we covered kind of the larger site, but really as far as the church complex itself, decided that going through a similar evolution through the setting forth of priorities. So the first was creating these public outward spaces of the church and having them edge the civic plaza. So the cafe, the career center, the farmer's market, which can extend outdoors into this space, a daycare, and the community center with a gym, all edge upon this larger civic plaza. The second was for reflective or more inwardly focused spaces to be adjacent to the water. Now specifically, this rill of water flows alongside the main aisle of the sanctuary and continues down into a pool which is right behind the altar wall. The third was to create an interior or private courtyard for the church members themselves. So such a space allows the church members to congregate outside, whether it's outside the fellowship hall or outside the main entrance to the school, or really outside of the sanctuary itself. And it really allows the church functions and the church itself to extend outdoors and becomes not only one, but a series of outdoor rooms. The fourth was to create a visual connection between the civic plaza and the sanctuary itself. And this is really to allow the outsiders, people who may just be passing by or maybe even live in the neighborhood, to really understand the sacred nature of the church complex. But it also allows rituals that are occurring within the church to spill out of the church, its front doors, come down the steps, and people outside, if they're cafes, people walking along, they can really become a part of those rituals just by seeing them. And so finally was really the connection of the interior plaza, the interior courtyard, to the water. Now, this not only allows the church members to realize their spiritual connection to the water, but it also allows them to understand their ecological responsibilities and their stewardship of the earth. So while The community elements here, the school and the fellowship hall, attempt to maintain an orthogonal and material character that's similar to the existing buildings of the site. The sanctuary itself distinguishes itself as a unique and sacred space, both in its rotated orientation, its materiality, and its driving upward force. The base of the sanctuary is lined with a clear glazing, which really allows the people who are walking down this main aisle within the sanctuary to connect with the water and the rail outside. In addition, this walkway that is adjacent to this rail extends the full length of the site, going from the bell tower all the way down to the retention ponds, which really emphasizes once again the importance of water in the church community. Some of the more prominent pathways on the site really speak to the duality of this church. So the one outside the fellowship hall, which really allows people on a nice day to come outside and almost double this space. This reaches out towards not only the water, but also the trees. And it really emphasizes the importance of natural stewardship of the church. Now the other spans the length of the ponds, the sanctuary, which is across into the Civic Plaza, all the way to the bell tower. And it really emphasizes serving the community. So while the Episcopal Church has really struggled with declining membership in the past decade, the response needs to take into account the lives and the motivations of a more modern society. To reimagine the church, one must not try to bring people to the church. One must bring the church to the people. Thank you. I would welcome your questions and comments.
I have a question.
We're going to try.
You basically have to, because nobody can hear you. It's a little bit like a Latin mass.
I just have a question. Do you see your project as a prototype?
I can repeat it.
Do you see your, turn it off?
Yeah, I might have turned it off. She asked.
Do you see your, your project as
Thank you, Brian.
prototypical, as not necessarily perhaps the vocabulary, but sort of the increments, the relationship to site, the relationship of program, context, as a prototype for distributing outwardly, or is it a one of a kind?
It is not a one of a kind. I do see this as a potential for a prototype. And really it's not just as distribution through Raleigh. It could be applied in many different situations, many different denominations as well.
So if you were to list the criteria, the program, maybe not program, maybe that's hard to put words in your mouth, but the criteria for, you were to hand off the baton to another architect or another community, what would those criteria be?
Criteria for really transitioning this particular project to a broader sense potentially is one, understanding the community that you're dealing with, the people of the church or another particular group, what their belief system is. In particular, the Episcopal Church has a very strong stewardship or belief as stewardship of the natural environment. So that sort of became more important as I was learning of that. Really understanding that, I think bringing the church to the people, being in locations where people already are, is likely going to be important in a variety of situations. I don't say that, I want to kind of qualify that may not be true across the board, but in churches, in groups that are struggling with these concepts that people are just so busy that they can't find time to go to church, to go to synagogue, to a variety of things. I think that would be a major takeaway. Definitely put it in locations where people are already spending their time.
Michele,
This is a lot of power.
Actually, Brian knows where the on-off switch
the
is.
reason we're doing this is that this space gets acoustically active from people upstairs. If you talk into the microphone, you'll notice it has tended to calm the volume in this space.
No problem. I'm used to being in front of you.
Otherwise, we lose it.
First of all, I need to disclose a couple of things. I went to an Episcopal school, went to chapel every Wednesday for 5 years, and it was nothing. I mean, it confirms, what you've said absolutely confirms my experience. I mean, the church was completely disconnected from the community in many ways. The second thing I should disclose before I ask my questions is I spent 3 years visiting my son and his wife, who was at Duke doing her intern residency. They lived in Durham rather than Raleigh, so I know this area. So I think the idea of bringing the church, I think that the thesis of this thesis is fascinating and commendable. I mean, bringing a church into a context like this. I would make one point. I think the retention pond, if I understand, is no longer a retention pond. It's a permanent water feature, isn't it? I mean, that's a rhetorical question. If you're going to do this water thing, it's no longer a retention pond. So you probably should change that label. I think your intention is for this to always have water in it, right? So it's no longer a retention pond. I think the question, I had two questions that you can address. Having created the piazza, I'm curious as to why the perimeter of that piazza, the buildings and the uses that are framing it on all four sides are not more energized and intensified than they appear to be. I mean, it looks to me like, looking at that diagram, that it's framed on the north by a couple of, I think they're residential. I'm not sure what those two rectangles are. The question is having created the piazza with a church on it, and of course what leaps into my mind is Piazza Navona and Italy, or many other places here, where there is a church sitting on a public space that is lined by other uses that very much make the church part of the community. I'm curious as to why you haven't actually concentrated, if you will, some of those uses and functions that are bringing people, why the people are there, more immediately in conjunction with the piazza. That's one question. The other thing is, can you say something more about the geometry, the form of the building, and what is the origin of the gestalt of this building?
Sure. So first, we talked about basically why I haven't really developed, the there for the surrounding buildings. And I struggled with my committee for a while on figuring out kind of this urban context. And I got caught up for a long time. And I kept saying, I want to design the church. I want to get to the church. And to be quite fair, if I had another year, I would definitely put more into those surrounding buildings so that they became, these better destinations surrounding this church. But the real reason is that I really wanted to focus my attention and my energy on designing the church itself. So these surrounding buildings, they're kind of rectangles right now, but the idea is that perhaps the ground levels include these cute little cafes, or maybe they're similar to the community type elements that are on the ground level.
I understand. My question really is, it's something you can really almost diagram, and I'm just curious that having created with Gatso, that public place at the center of this, to me seems like a very good idea, and to have a church there, and have the entrance. I mean, I think you've made a lot of good decisions vis-a-vis the church. It just seems to me that those, whatever is on that immediate, the edges of that space is consequential. Yeah, and then, since you talked about the church, then tell us about the church.
Roger, I wonder if also indicative of that is the notion that on the large-scale plan, the plaza is sort of lobbed off on one side, and it makes me imagine that if there were more time to push the thesis, that a lot of critical sections through that plaza and seeing the plaza in the whole as part of this piece, as a kind of weight on the other end of the dumbbell from the body of water.
Well, it begs the question. I mean, you have this and this flanking. I mean, I think it's a terrific idea to create these two different kinds of spaces. So tell us about the building.
Sure. Now, like I said, the building itself, these external elements, the community serving program, really, to me, needed to have a character very similar to the already existing buildings, which are kind of got like a Lowe's and an Office Depot and a Sam's Club. So they're very, they're maybe one warehouse story high, brick, masonry built. So the character of almost this wrapper is really a reflection of that, because I wanted those to read as really these profane elements. And then the church itself needed to be different, needed to stand out, needed to have a different, not only the material character, but the form of it as well. And turning it at that angle, one, it did set it apart from its surrounding context. And I tried a variety of kind of different shapes to the building, forms of the building. I felt that it needed to have this upward directionality as more of a symbolic towards the heavens type thing. But as far as the church itself, I felt that really it needed to be close to the plaza in order for some of those rituals to spill out. So I'd explored some that the church, the sanctuary itself, was pushed farther into the site, more protected, but it also didn't allow the interplay between the church community and the outside community quite as well.
I have a question for you, Michele.
Sure.
I'd like to hear you expand a little. First of all, I agree with Roger. I think this is it's an exciting exploration, and I think the notion that you can take it from, maybe it's a prototype, you can take it from place to place in different regions and areas is pretty commendable and interesting. But I'm also interested in the day-to-day ritual, not just what happens on Sunday, but what happens the other 6 days of the week. And also, who is this appealing to? Is it appealing only to Episcopalians? Is it appealing to others? What's the dialogue between, if you're not religious, if you're in the secular community, what are your ideas about inviting those people in and how porous the building and the design and the precinct is?
So thank you for your question. I did consider that part of it. It's one reason that I really wanted these community elements kind of on this front edge, because I wanted to welcome in people that were not members of the church. Perhaps they live in the surrounding neighborhoods, perhaps they are just passing by trying to go to Sam's Club for their Sunday shopping. Or whatever it is, they can come and they can use these elements. Some just basic research on the community itself. It really illustrated that some of these elements were in need within the community. So I thought that they would really serve the outside community well, not just the church. Now, the school itself, which is a couple, like the main office is on the main floor, but the major classrooms are on the second floor. It is sponsored by the church itself, but not necessarily religious. So anyone in the community could go to the church. I actually did a study looking at where the schools and the churches were surrounding the area, and it really showed that a school was needed in that particular neighborhood. So I imagine that on a normal day, during the week every day, but Sunday, you're going to have children, going to school. You'll have community members populating some of this, and potentially some of them will wander in, see kind of an interesting what's going on down here. And really that's supposed to be very welcome.
So is it fair to say north is up in your drawings? Because I'm looking
in this drawing, north is this way. Yes.
Okay, just trying to,
Rotated from the
It's rotated to the
I'm trying to appreciate kind of the solar qualities of the section.
Point of information, Michele, so this is a public elementary school, not a church Sunday school?
It is a church school. It's private. It's not public.
But it's a
But it,
regular school?
It's a regular school. yes.
It's a weekday.
I think I can make a couple of comments. Are you about to ask? Okay.
He has the microphone.
So, I was going to ask just to talk a little more about the church itself, because that is the piece of the composition where you've been more deliberate about form than in the liner buildings that wrap and that link the whole complex back into the broader context. The choice of the butterfly roof, the very, very deliberate roof, and then the choice of exposed structure, some of those sorts of things that were sort of the big form generators in the sanctuary, and the notion of sanctuary, and in a very prosaic part of town, where you're trying to create a stronger sense of urban identity. The actual sanctuary itself is the sanctuary in this entire mega block, right? So it should have a dramatically different sort of character and aspiration than everything else around it. So how about something about that?
Sure. I think actually, I can throw that around if you so choose to play. The sanctuary itself, I really thought about the idea of ritual going through the church, having it be not only linear, but also focusing in on where the altar would be, where the service would really be focused. The church itself, actually slopes down with the site. So not only you have these inward sloping or inward focusing walls, but you also have a downward sloping as well. The butterfly roof is not only assisting with that focusing element, but it also helps to collect the water through a scupper in the pond below, or sort of behind the altar wall. And really,
What was shown in that perspective?
that's
the downspout?
That's the downspout.
Is it like clear made of glass?
It's clear made of glass, so you can see the collection of the water within or behind the altar wall. So it really emphasizes the importance not only of the spiritual nature of water, but also the stewardship element in the Episcopal Church.
I'll buy that. That's all good stuff, I'll buy that. And one thing I would suggest, so if you're doing a sanctuary that is a singular form space, most of your sort of cataloging of studies are space making from the outside in. I think you might have looked at it from the inside out, sort of, as actually the way when we go about designing that space as opposed to other spaces in a composition like this. That is the one space that's sort of more of an inside-out space than an outside-in.
It's interesting you say that. Some of the earlier studies, I wasn't looking quite so much at form, but I was taking the idea of inside out as opposed to outside in. And I was really looking at the rituals themselves. And this was earlier on, before the church even became a figment. But it was taking the site itself and imagining what rituals would actually be taking place within the church, but imagining them in the exterior context of the site.
See, I want to first commend you on a brilliant thesis program. I think you've really identified a really fascinating set of circumstances, both contextual as well as programmatic, and it's really a real thesis definition. I think it's really, really fantastic. The notion that you would blur programs so emphatically between a shopping mall center and the mosaic and the profane, sacred and profane, blur them so emphatically, I think is a fantastic point of departure. In a way, it seems like if you take my question to you about the kind of prototype was perhaps not as much a formal question, but more a sense of what is the kind of primary driver that this might provide communities and architects actually for focusing on how to interpret this program within this sort of new sort of context, cultural context. And the environment to sort of focus on this religion as being a kind of steward of the environment, I think is a really interesting, it sort of makes me think of the kind of slow religion movement, right? So it's this notion of local in a way, which is not necessarily formal, but it is actually a sensibility, a kind of concern for the environment that brings a kind of leadership position to this congregation. I think is really, really fascinating. I know nothing about the religion, but I can imagine that might be worthy. So first of all, when I look at your context, your site, I really, see, I can't point and do this at the same time, but I'm going to try. I really think the choice of site, you should look at that context, the kind of change of scale between the kind of immediate context and the surrounding, and the establishment, the beginning of establishing a kind of backyard spine that might extend much far beyond the actual site that you've chosen, that not necessarily connecting the schools, but the idea of introducing a kind of public, in a way, semi-public, kind of that sort of insinuates itself throughout the sort of backyards or non-necessarily public, to me is a really fascinating introduction that you're beginning to try to blur the boundaries, not just of programs, but also of, not necessarily ownership, but of beginning to break down barriers, ethnic barriers, physical barriers, spatial barriers, ownership barriers in a much larger context, I think would in fact really bring back meaning to this initiative. So, but also reinforce this notion of another way of engaging the context through slow movement, whether it's bicycle or vehicular, pedestrian or children, so that you really begin to kind of expand this path, and that the church might exist at one moment along that, but that the kind of greater initiative is not just the pond on your site, but it's connecting a whole series of parks. I think Minnesota had that sort of pearl of parks, so at a sort of local scale, to introduce that as an infrastructure, I think would be really like one of the things you just set in stone. This will not be by itself. And so I think this is the start of a really fantastic initiative, but I would encourage you to kind of, in terms of your documentation, I don't know, do you do a thesis book here at the end, document, to really maybe zoom out for one moment and really build on that map? So I think from that point of view, it's fantastic. I also think what you mind as a typology of building in terms of the complex is, which has already been talked about, is the notion in a way of the monastic, or the whether it's the Piazza San Marco, or whether it's the Uffizi, or but this notion of a kind of public space, which you label as circulation, but that becomes a kind of shared space to which multiple programs can accrete. And I think that, going back to your question of how does one engage the specifics of the other programs in that, I think maybe that might have that this diagram might have also included the other elements of the site as a kind of collector. So the back ends are sort of maybe a little messier, a little bit more sort of local, and then the space itself that becomes the kind of essence of that space to which these buildings are accreted. I think that's really important. What I'm kind of looking for, this, I don't know if everyone can see that because it's quite, this baptismal font, it's almost in a parking lot. To me that is, I think, in a way where you're going, it's not so much insulating these into these interior programs, but it's really about blurring, the notion that the font might be here, but it's a fountain,
Right.
6 days of the week, and suddenly it takes on a kind of cultural and religious meaning, I think really gets into the much more specific blurring of boundaries that I think you're after. So I think in your overemphasis on creating the space of the institution, perhaps you sort of let go a little bit. It becomes so monastic, so insulated, that I think you lost a little bit of steam in terms of really engaging that context the way you wanted it to. But I also then, going back to that space, the definition, to me the notion, this was where I would have probably spent a lot more effort and focus, just in terms of connecting the public spaces through, one has garden, one has public, religious space, one has public space, so those are the crucial ones. And though I really appreciate the water and how you bring it in, I was looking for the perspective of that space, right? That should, we have the outside here, which is, probably much more like the architecture that's surrounding it, but that is the space one really wants to sort of focus on. The last comment I'll make, so I don't monopolize, but I thought this is so great, is the idea of the building itself. And I think in all of your precedents, this is also going back, I think, to what you were talking about, the notion of all the precedents, you deal with light in a very precise way, and many of them also deal with water in a very precise way. And I think in your project, the sanctuary itself might have addressed both the notion of environment in maybe a more spiritual way, and I say spiritual without really understanding what it means to this religion, but in making it such a public building, and so much light, and so much glass, and so sort of, I think you lose, it's almost what you were suggesting, that maybe one would have begun with a very generic volume, like a big box, and then begun to sort of transform that box to allow light to come in certain ways, to allow water to be part of that context, to respond to environment in very specific ways. So it's a bit as if you focused on the architecture, but rather than on the ways in which the environment might be rendered spiritual. So it's not just about making a retention pond or a drain for water, but it's really about bringing in an incredible, like belief in the power of light, the power of the sun, and sort of defamiliarizing it to turn it into a religious experience so that the people, go out there and do good things in the environment. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
But I really commend the process that you're working with.
I just following on that, just two quick questions.
You have to hold it close to you.
Two quick questions. I was curious, given the symbolic content and light and water, why you chose not to orient the church toward the east, which is the traditional orientation, not 100%. And then the rising sun and so forth. And then the other question or comment is this idea of blurring boundaries in a commercial setting, which I think is really great, actually has precedence in the storefront churches, which start out in immigrant, low-income communities, and then as the community changes, the community moves on and the buildings take on different uses. And I was wondering if you gave any thought to the change of the place over time as people become more affluent and move out to the suburbs, what might become of these buildings?
So the first question, as far as the orientation of the church, I did explore in earlier versions an eastward-facing church, and really it came down to I thought it was important to have a more direct connection with the water and the topography of the site, which lended itself more so to this particular location. However, in order to really capture that eastward light, I allowed for a glazing on, it's actually back here behind the choir loft, so that the east light comes in during the service, really illuminating the altar type space. For your question as far as where do I see this over time, really I'm imagining that, hopefully the church will maintain its presence there over time, but those surrounding buildings, they could push and pull, they can give and take, they can grow with the changing community. So if at a time some of the needs of the community change, maybe these community elements can change with it. So it's really understanding the contemporary context and allowing those changes to happen.
What's nice about your scheme is the idea that you're repurposing this retail plaza, which is a major problem in America, all these fading retail places, and adding this intervention that you do there is in ways, and I alluded to earlier, is a nice prototype. A couple of just short comments. Number one is, I kept thinking about the laws of the Indies, because of the Hispanic population. Maybe that culturally is not a viable thing, to reference for this particular culture, but the idea of the institution on the plaza surrounded by activities and retail and things is sort of something that they understood. The only other thing I would say about the site plan, I think if you really wanted to get people there and to go by and understand it, is I think what you probably want to do a little bit more is understanding the passive movement in and out of the retail. Because as people are coming in and out, you want to be able to put things so that as they come out, they go, aha, look at that, that's a cool thing. And the thing that I think, the thing that is, I think to me is a kind of throwaway piece is the community hall in the back. Because those things in these kinds of communities get incredible amount of use. And I would probably try and put that somewhere that was on a very, very important path of travel on a daily basis so people could see all the different activities that are going through there. In the back, I don't know, I think I can appreciate the site plan. It seems like it's caught between trying to make something that's very walled and private for the school, which might be a lot of good reasons to do that, and something which is more engaging and open with the community. But the community hall might have entered into a dialogue with the sanctuary itself, such that that was the place that on a daily basis, people are going by and seeing the Cub Scouts, the adult leadership, whoever's having meetings and these things that are out there, present, and engages people.
Well, we can wrap up
this session so we can move on to the next. But along with Garth and Brian, I want to thank Michele for bringing this thesis to the entire school community. I think not only could it be a prototype for the project, but Michelle's a good kind of citizen of the school, and it's a prototype on how one might approach thesis with a clear idea, good kind of research into how one would select a site, and then bringing a design project to prove that thesis that was laid out. I think the comments around that kind of middle zone between the community that was created on the larger site and the institution itself are well taken. I'm glad that the figure ground up there of the wider community was pointed out, and then also the discussion around the institution and the building itself. And it's nice to see a student take on this idea of bringing new life to a place that needs it. Thanks.
Thank you.